Thank you for joining us for this look at the path to STEM innovation. I'm Francis Vigin, CEO here at KnowAtom. At KnowAtom, we're really interested not only in curriculum and classroom development, but also the stuff of innovation, specifically the purpose of STEM, higher order thinking, and the relationship between scientific knowledge and engineered solutions to everyday issues. I'm pleased to have with us today our special guest, Dr. Carol Tang, who is a paleontologist and executive director of the Children's Creativity Museum in San Francisco, California. Carol has been an active and celebrated member of the American Association of University Women. She has literally written the book on the Jurassic period for Encyclopedia Britannica. She has helped design exhibits for the California Academy of Sciences and even deployed science programs into Golden Gate Park to help the broader community understand the impact of climate change on California. Among her many accolades, Carol was named one of California's top leading women in STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, by the California STEM Learning Network. We're honored to have her here with us to discuss her path to innovation. Carol, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So I would love to know, first and foremost, a little bit about your background in terms of how you have come from being a paleontologist and a scientist to director of the Children's Creativity Museum, in terms of really what nudged your curiosity into STEM and sort of helped set you on this path.
Well, I mean, paleontology, I think, is, for a good reason, one of the most popular science topics. I think there's just a natural curiosity about, fossils and old things and deep time and what was the Earth like before. And, we see that in young kids as well. So I think that there's a lot of paleontologists like me who ended up doing a lot of public education because, even at Thanksgiving dinner or at dinner parties, but also in classrooms around the country, paleontologists, scientists are going and talking about their work. And so, even when I first started in graduate school, I was going to elementary schools and talking to teachers about what it means to be a paleontologist, the lessons that we can apply to our world today, but also the context of science and wanting to become a scientist. So as you see here, I've actually even worked for NASA astrobiology, looking for how we would go about thinking about life on other planets, and the way to do it is, as a paleontologist, is to look here on Earth. So I think my science has always been a very accessible touch point with the general public, and I've loved talking about the field and my work with the general public. And so I don't think it was a really tough switch to go into the museum world. I think that after having been a university professor for several years, I realized that in order to really inspire a larger number of people, we need to start at a younger age. And your audience certainly knows that it really is important when kids are young and they're influenced by so many different factors, that we provide a good role model and good inspiration for STEM. And so I left the university, a tenure track position, to start working at a natural history museum in San Francisco, as you said, and then also since then a couple other museum settings and positions. But it's always come back to, how much I gained as a scientist and my love of science, and using that as inspiration to how do we then help the next generation find that same passion in themselves. So, for example, in this project that was with the Clinton Global Initiative, was a project where we looked at how to make creative writing and science become this natural pairing. And that is a really nice segue to my position now at the Children's Creativity Museum, because for me, there's nothing different between being a creative artist or performer or writer or a creative scientist or creative engineer or even a creative teacher. That really there's so much underlying mindset and practices and attitudes and the way that you think about problems and you think about people that are really common to not just different career paths, but just to people in general and adults and kids. So that's kind of, I guess, my path from really loving the science to realizing that the science is a great way to inspire kids and to really change the world and tackle those problems of society and how to improve our world and our society. And that's where I kind of see the link with museums being a place where we can really influence large number of kids and teachers.
So as you kind of think into your own perhaps elementary or middle school days, where did this sort of passion for questioning and curiosity and inspiring others to engage in curiosity and questioning first start for you? Was there a particular experience or event that you can think of that kind of got that started, or perhaps a teacher?
I think, I've had really great teachers who've given me projects and really spent time with me outside of the classroom, all through elementary, middle school, and high school. But maybe the reason I am in a museum now is when I think back to my childhood and what my parents say is that probably some of the greatest influences were museum and out-of-school time experiences. And it's because I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and I went to school for 5 years in elementary school in Buffalo through the blizzards. And what my parents remember and what I remember is we spent our weekends going to the aquarium, the Natural History Museum, the Art Museum. That was just a part of my life. And so I think that that's why I'm so committed to museums as a partner for what happens in school, is that I think it's important for kids to see that learning is everywhere, that's not confined to the classroom, that everything you see on TV or when you go to a museum or do an after-school program or a hike with your parents, all of those times are ones where you can be inspired and learn, and where you kind of engage your senses and you kind of think about the big picture, the big questions, the things that you're interested in, tap into your own interests. So I'd have to say that I've been very lucky to have really good teachers, but it's probably the out-of-school time museum experiences that really opened up the world to me and made me see the world as a learning laboratory everywhere I go.
It's interesting that that sort of out-of-school time extension of the classroom and those experiences sort of kicked off your curiosity and almost perhaps as sort of an exposure to a world that wasn't a part of your everyday experience, and sort of a first forum to engage in something science or engineering related and spark curiosity. Did you always know you wanted to be a geologist, or was there a couple of steps before that? When did you make that decision? How did you come about it?
So the interesting thing is, really, I surprised my family. I probably surprised myself when I became a geologist. My family is an immigrant family, and we valued science. But for me, everybody always thought I was going to become a TV journalist, because I'm this talkative Asian girl, and Asian women role models in America, especially when I was growing up in the 80s, were really anchors and journalists, and so everyone thought that's what I was going to do, and I thought I was going to do that. I was the editor of my high school newspaper. I was editor of my college literary magazine, and I even won the Asian American Journalists Association Award in college. I really thought that's what I was going to do, because I didn't have any other expectations or role models. But I loved science, and so I talked myself into thinking I was going to be a science journalist. So I majored in paleontology as an undergrad, but I still thought I was going to be a journalist. I even went to graduate school, and I still kept deluding myself and my family that I was going to be a journalist. And what really changed my mind was when I got to graduate school, I started doing research and started teaching as a teaching assistant. It clicked for me, and I finally realized, I'm actually a scientist. Why am I denying this part of me and pretending I'm going to do something else? I still love journalism. I love communication. But my heart is in the science. There's a reason why I've stuck to it and why I went to graduate school in science, not in journalism. And so I think it's been a long path in that I've always been interested, but I don't think I ever thought of myself as a scientist or felt that was something that I could do or would want to do. And I think that it's again, so many people have encouraged me along the way. If I had given up my studies, then by the time I realized I wanted to be a scientist, I couldn't have done it. So if I hadn't taken calculus in high school, if I hadn't taken those classes in chemistry and sweated through my exams, I would not have I would have closed the door to finally finding my true identity. So I'm very thankful along the way, but I'm just such a big believer that that it does take all these other factors that allow you to finally find your passion and then really pursue what you're interested in.
It's interesting how, in so many ways, after-school programs or out-of-school time programs play such an important role in extending that school experience, and you're bringing up an entirely different one, but also important, this idea of mentoring and sort of inspiring the next generation as well with kind of your story. And I know that you've been involved with FabFems as a role model and the importance of having role models. How do you see that playing out, especially as a woman who is a scientist? Is that something that we can do more of in some way and is important? Is it particularly important, do you think, for encouraging girls to become scientists?
I think what the studies have been showing is that girls actually are taking the same amount of science prep classes and in fact having better grades than boys do in high school, especially in elementary school and so on. But for some reason, they're not identifying themselves as scientists. They don't go into science. So I do think that seeing role models and seeing that there's not one mold of being a scientist. This is true for boys as well, and so on. But this idea of really broadening the concept of what it means to be a scientist, or how you need science in your life. You don't even need to be a scientist to still need to be science literate in terms of your medical decisions, where you buy your house, whether you compost or buy plastic. All these things are science decisions. So I do think trying to broaden the identity of what is a scientist, what is science, and who can be or who can identify as a scientist is really important. And we've also been finding out that, for a lot of girls and folks that are underrepresented in the sciences from any demographic, is that they need to see that scientists can lead lives that are like theirs, so that if you have a hobby, you can still be a scientist and still have a hobby. You can still listen to hip hop and still be a scientist. So this idea of sort of broadening what it means, and that it does mean those of us who are role models need to be out there with our personal lives as well as our scientific and our sort of intellectual lives, because what we're seeing is that people who don't go into science, it's not necessarily they don't have the skills or even the interests, but there's, again, this intangible about not seeing yourself fit into that mold. So we need to break the mold, I guess, and all of us together can break that mold.
What do you think, in terms of K-12 educators, the folks in the classroom, that they can do specifically to help break that mold?
Well, I think that some really great projects that I remember from my childhood maybe seem so simple to the teachers that but I don't know if they realize how effective they are. So something that sticks in my mind is in junior high school, we had a very sort of classic example of a project where you go and collect 30 wildflowers and identify them. And I was not a big nature person. I was a museum person, but never spent a lot of time out in nature because my family really kept me sort of protected and indoors, especially in Buffalo. But the idea of going out and finding wildflowers, I had to craft the whole project. Like, where would I go? How would I collect them? How would I preserve them? How would I identify them? And that project sticks with me. And the reason I mention that in response to your answer is I think that teachers can allow kids to approach projects in their own ways. And that helps broaden this idea that there's not one way to do science, that each of us have our own strengths, our own approaches. We could get to the same answer, or we could actually come up with different answers, and maybe that's what's exciting. And so I think that teachers, even in setting up projects that are open-ended and that allow for different perspectives and allow for different approaches or learning styles or experiences to be valid in completing a project, I think those are really successful ways to reinforce the idea that every child has a good thinking, can craft good plans, can come up with ways to investigate questions and come up with right answers. And that, I think, is something that maybe teachers don't realize how important that personal connection, that personal buy-in is, not only to the child's success, but in reinforcing this idea that there are different ways to be a scientist, there are different ways to be successful.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it seems like that's a natural tie with your work now at the Children's Creativity Museum, sort of thinking about how this evolution or perhaps synergy between sort of the sciences and scientific thinking, creativity, and then public venues like museums can help to tie that together. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about the museum and maybe specifically how the Children's Creativity Museum is really redefining what a museum is or what you can expect from a museum in the 21st century?
Great. So the Children's Creativity Museum, our mission is to nurture creativity and collaboration in all children and families. And what we really do, what does that mean? What does it mean to nurture creativity? One is we assume that there's creativity in everyone. Every child and every adult has creativity, and our job is to bring it out. It's to help nurture it and to help them express it. And sometimes it's through technology, sometimes it's through hands-on projects, sometimes it's from design challenges. So I think the 21st Century Museum is that, just like in education, instead of this passive, we know everything, let's present it to you and you are going to absorb it all. And you think of the classic, museums of the past few centuries, it's kind of like here's a pantheon to knowledge and you come in and you absorb it. And what I think both in classrooms and in museums is this idea that, well, actually that may not be the most effective way to do things, and what we really need to do is have a dialogue so that our visitors are actually co-creating content, that instead of becoming just the consumers of a museum exhibit, you're actually producing something, you're actually making meaning for your own life and expressing your own creative expression and your experiences. So instead of exhibits, we have sort of sit-down spaces where you can get into the flow of things and you can make something. And so it's about sort of this interactive, deep learning, as everyone's talking about, rather than kind of 30 seconds at many exhibits that are kind of giving you little factoids. It's really about sort of making your own sense.
Sure. Well, I was really impressed when I had the opportunity to visit the museum a bit earlier, and was impressed by the real diversity of opportunities for children of all ages to be able to create. And really, I like the way that you said that. It's participating in actually making the museum a museum. I had the opportunity to be there before any children had arrived, and it appropriately felt empty. You didn't really feel like the museum was alive, and creativity is something that's very much driven by humans. The chairs, the computers, and so on aren't creative, but if you fill the museum with children, it really runs on their creativity. And I think about that in the context of higher order thinking, and really where at KnowAtom we're so focused on science, technology, engineering, and math in the K-12 classroom specifically, and how, as you were saying, we engage students in that process and place aside that sort of pantheon, vault of knowledge approach, and engage students in creating, evaluating, and analyzing simultaneously, kind of rearranging the traditional Bloom's taxonomy from a focus on lower order skills that are really fact-oriented and something that is much higher order and focused on what we really, I guess maybe as humans even, bring to each other and to our communities. And I was wondering, before we even look closer at the exhibits and sort of the labs, because they really aren't exhibits, they are labs, and they require children to participate to really bring the museum alive. How do you see, I guess it feels like a pivot point to me, or a balance in a sense, where this creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skill crosses into many disciplines, and how does that have relevance as a scientist when you look at it, and then thinking about that relationship in science and this questioning and generating knowledge, and engineers using that knowledge to develop technology solutions? How do you see that sort of kind of balance playing out, not only, I guess, in scientific disciplines and as a scientist, but in more maybe fictional disciplines as artists and so on?
Well, first, I mean, I think it's been surprising to people that I would go from, being a scientist at a university, in a research university, and then coming to a children's museum, and I just don't see any discrepancy between that, is because I do feel like good scientists, creative scientists, the ones who are making the breakthroughs, inventors and engineers, and artists and writers, as we mentioned earlier, have very similar processes. I mean, I think everybody looks at the world around them, tries to understand something, and then tries to figure out how could they answer questions about the world around them. Whether you're observing human nature or nature, I think creative people are asking the right questions, figuring out how to answer those questions, and then trying it. And I like this sort of look at this higher order thinking, because I think that's actually much more reflective of what scientists do. We have this idea that science does this, the scientific method. And in fact, when you ask scientists and engineers, things get scrambled. And I think as a paleontologist, I've never been a big fan of the scientific method because, of course, we don't have time machines. We can't go back and see how Jurassic animals behaved. And so our science has always been a little bit different. And so I think this thinking about evaluating and analyzing and doing these concurrently or iteratively in order to create is much more natural for any kind of creative person, including scientists and engineers. And here at the museum, I think this is our approach, although, now that you're sharing it, it could really help us define what we do, in that we really want kids to be able to find their own way to get to the solution, and there's not one solution. And so this idea of sort of taking information, experiences that you have, and then really evaluating, analyzing, and then questioning yourself again. That didn't work. How would I do it better? And what we have here at the museum is not only, as you said, sort of studios and labs, but we also have facilitated we've made sure that each of them are facilitated so that our educators are asking these prompting questions and having kids sort of re-look at what they've done, or helping them reflect on the processes they use. So, what were you thinking when you did this? Why did you do this instead of this? How would you do it differently? And helping kids understand that they have a process that, they analyzed and evaluated and created. And by helping them realize that they can do it, it gives them confidence, and it gives them the ability to do it again. And I think we now know in education that reflection and metacognition is really key to having something stick. And so, that's where I think that the higher order thinking is applied in our museum and then reinforced in different ways.
It's interesting because when we think about processes, it seems that science and even engineering to some degree, with the engineering design process, scientific method engineering design process can be taken to extremes. And I can entirely understand that idea that kind of a point A to point B is not a direct route, and the idea that science and engineering is always some sort of a linear process, but yet thinking too about the idea that we each have processes, and even in terms of evacuation of buildings or so on, there are specific processes that sort of get refined over time. It's almost a logic in a sense. And thinking about higher order thinking, it seems like perhaps the next generation is to kind of combine them all, and how is it that we can involve creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills into sort of the macro creative process of going from a question or a problem to some sort of solution, but with the realization that like you were saying, it's iterative, and it's not known. We can't go back and see the dinosaurs. There's no time machine. So it's interesting. How does that sort of play out in the different lab experiences that you have at the museum? I think I have here an example of the Imagination Lab.
Right. So the Imagination Lab is really for our youngest visitors. But even here, we know that even when you're 18 months old, you're trying to learn about the world around you. And so we have lots of building type experiences in the Imagination Lab with very different materials, magnets and foam blocks and Lego pieces and so on. One of the things that we not only encourage is building and exploring of materials, but also playing with other kids who, in our society today, it's possible some of these kids will never see each other in their social circles or in their schools, but museums need to be that place where society can come together and create things together. So isn't it a great idea to have kids feel like they can build something and build something with other people and build things with people who think differently, are from different areas of the world. So, this idea of sort of building but collaboratively is really important for young kids. As we know, social emotional learning is also very important. So we try to build that and link those together. This is a picture from our claymation studio, our animation studio, and it is one of our signature experiences. And what we do here is we really encourage kids to get their imagination and bring it to life. So kids have stories, they have worlds and characters in their head, but they're not able to express them. And even with crayons and paper and things like that, they're not really able to sort of have the dexterity or the language skills to be able to kind of set those down. But with clay, and these days with stop motion video, off the shelf, software, you can actually sort of in just an hour be able to tell your story with really interesting characters who do fun things in fun places. And so this is again, it's a signature experience for ours, is that helping kids create video instead of just watch video, and to acknowledge that they have great stories that they can share with their family and friends in the world. So how do we help kids sort of be empowered to think of their story, how to put it together, and how to communicate it with other people?
Absolutely. In terms of the STEM connection, I know as we're going through these labs, here I think we're seeing definitely the use of T, the technology in STEM, and then in building and creating, especially in a problem-solving sense, we see the E. Is that an intentional process as you're going through here to try and bring different elements of STEM alive, for instance, in the community lab or in other labs as we're going through?
Yes, so it ends up that not only am I a scientist, but my education manager was a middle school biology teacher. She's a credentialed teacher, and some of our educators also come from science backgrounds, environmental sciences, for example. So I don't think it's actually an accident. I think that we have acknowledged and realized that good creativity and STEM processes are very, very similar. The other thing that we recognize is that the storytelling, like the claymation video, it's content agnostic. In other words, we work with teachers all the time who are teaching science content, for example, the water cycle, or watersheds and the ecosystem and recycling and a lot of science and environmental science topics. And what they want to do is be able to bring those science topics to life. And they come here and they have their kids storyboard a video using water cycle as the content, and using that as the inspiration, but letting the kids kind of express a story of their own using the content. And so that's another way where we explicitly not just use the technology as a background, but actually insert science content as part of the experience as well. So there's technology that's sort of explicit, and it's about the T in STEM. And one of the other labs that you have a photo of is the robot coding lab, where we are explicit about teaching coding right here, about using a computer language to be able to program robots to take on certain challenges. So the T can be explicit, but could also be just part of the storytelling process. And we find that science teachers especially are really excited to bring creativity in and bring sort of a storytelling component that kids really are drawn to, but using scientific content. And we do find that teachers say their students learn more about the content because they're forced to use it and apply it in the story. This robot coding exhibition is one that we just opened recently, and you know, a lot of us in STEM and in education know what coding is and the importance of computer science. But what we found out was that a lot of parents don't really know what coding is. It just sounds like some sort of jargon. And so we've actually spent a lot of time communicating that coding is computer language where you can use to control computers and robots. And again, here's an example where we give them a fun challenge, like we can attach a pen to the robot and say, draw something. But then they have to use a language to tell the robots how to draw that. Or in this case, you can see that they have like an obstacle course or a maze that they have to navigate. So the kids think of it as sort of a problem or a challenge that they can succeed at. But in order to succeed at it, they have to learn how to code. And so it's a really, I think, the way that we can use real life and engage their natural, you know, desire to figure something out, and then learn some principles that they could use in career, but also, you know, important logical thinking and so on in curriculum.
It's interesting that that the museum really seems to be an opportunity to unpack a lot of what's going on in the classroom and also what's going on in students' minds through creativity, and take something that may be cognitive, something that's an idea, and in this case a particular shape or something that a student wants that robot to draw, and then in fact program it using technology, and then actually see the results of that in real time through the robot and be able to engage in that iterative process. So it really is on a metacognitive level, a physical level, an imaginative level, and a higher order thinking level, kind of bringing all of these things to life simultaneously. And in this case, you know, I suppose it's very sort of STEMmy, if we might want to call it that. But it's not only, like we've been saying all along here, is these skills aren't only for robots, and they aren't only for paleontology or physics or so on. And you mentioned something that really sparked my interest with, you know, parents. Teachers and students aren't the only stakeholder groups here. And I know you have a community lab. Can you talk a bit about how those stakeholder groups come together, and perhaps the community lab, and how this these experiences aren't only STEM or STEMmy entirely, if that's a word, but in fact they also are engaging in green screen productions and other you know, physical creative tasks, which are kind of, again, both sort of fiction and nonfiction combining.
Well, I think we find that parents are often surprised at what their kids can do. And I think some parents are also intimidated by STEM. So I think in our museum we really try to engage the parents and see that their kids can accomplish things. And also, if you give them a design challenge, you know, it's possible the kids are going to do better than the parents. And so I think it's a really good way to sort of reset attitudes, parental attitudes about what kids are capable of, what STEM is, and thinking of maybe their family as a creative family or a STEM family when maybe they were intimidated by that before. So I think we find it's often more important to engage the parent. The other thing that I'm sure that your teachers find too is that parents don't necessarily think of themselves as educators when in fact we all know that they're probably the biggest influence on the kids, more than teachers or obviously more than a museum educator could ever be. And so if we don't really get the parents to understand what a learning experience is, how to correctly challenge their kids or praise them in what we now know is more effective, and sort of helping parents realize that everything is a learning, it could be a learning moment. I think that we have to get them on our side and see themselves as educators in the broadest sense and in the best sense of the word. And so that is something that we really strive to do. So how do we make sure that the parents aren't just sort of checking their email or thinking this is a kid's activity, and making sure they're just as engaged. And in some ways, some of our educators, we feel like we're modeling good behavior and good questioning for teachers and parents, so that they see what it means to sort of probe and get your kids to reflect on what they've done. And a lot of parents haven't really done that themselves or seen it in action. And so when they see our educators do it, we hope that that sort of gives them an idea of what they could be doing every single day at home with their own kids. So I think that that's an important part of connecting, I think, the different sectors, parents and educators, in sort of recognizing that kids need a caring adult to be involved in their growing up. I think when you were saying about where we're able to distill some of the things, I think that's the challenge. And the wonderful thing about working in a museum is, on the one hand, we're lucky we don't have to give exams and we don't have to, teach a certain amount of information in a school year. On the other hand, we don't have very much time with the kids. And what we do has to be fun and engaging. People have to volunteer to come here. In fact, they pay to come here. Or for a field trip, teacher, it takes a lot of effort for a teacher to come here, even if we've waived the fee, the field trip fee. And so we know that the time with us is really valuable. We're really grateful for that time together. Well, we have to really make an experience that's fun and memorable and educational. And so we really have to distill it down into, that 2-hour time slot when you're here.
And, that idea, too, that this is a space where children are bonding with each other through creativity, but they're also bonding with teachers and parents. And to think of everybody would wishes that they have more time with their children, but to be able to sit down and spend that time with your child programming a robot, or engaging in a green screen production or a engineering design challenge, really it adds a whole new dimension. And I think too, from sort of a social emotional standpoint, for the students, it helps them understand how to relate to adults as well. I know that in the work we've done at KnowAtom, particularly in areas where there are conflict regions in UNHCR refugee camps and beyond, where students are trying to understand how to relate to their circumstances, to their new world, oftentimes in some of these camps, each other, and to adults, that creative play, but also one that involves these different sort of age groups as well, and sort of structures, whether it's parent or teacher, really plays a pretty powerful role. I wanted to ask you, in terms of the next generation science standards, one of the things that we talk about a lot is the idea of science and engineering practices. So the idea that within the context of science, and a lot of this, I should say, emanates from this definition of science and engineering that emanates from the National Research Council's work, which sort of led to the Next Generation Science Standards kind of a bit later, the idea that science is questioning, that it's answering questions through experimentation and developing scientific knowledge, and engineering is using that knowledge to solve problems through the development of technology, and technology not always being something that's electronic or plugging in, but in fact it could be a process, it could be a software program, and using math as a tool of communication. How do these next generation science and engineering practices play out, or how are you sort of focusing on those? I heard you mentioning sort of the modeling questions, the questioning process for parents and for teachers, and acting in almost a professional development role. But not only for teachers but for students, how how is the kind of planning of investigations and the sort of constructing solutions and so on, how is that structured when a teacher kind of envisions themselves perhaps coming on a field trip or a professional development workshop? How does that sort of come to life there?
Well, I think, I'm just such a big fan of next generation science standards. I can't tell you, because as a scientist, I think it more crisply, captures what I loved about science. It's about, not the things that are in the textbook, but the things that are yet to be in a textbook. All the questions that we still have about all the gaps in our knowledge, all these questions that we still don't understand about the world around us. So, I mean, as a scientist, I think next generation, and that's why I think you see the scientific community embracing them, is that I think it more accurately captures the essence of what scientific thinking or understanding is and why we love it. As a museum educator, it's wonderful because it now provides us with some language and some sort of outcomes and things like that of what we kind of felt and what we were doing in a museum as sort of an open-ended, voluntary place you go, entertainment and educational place. So I think for us as museum educators here at the Children's Creativity Museum, is that, one, it gives us some common language to really understand why we do things the way we do and how it links up and how we communicate it with parents, kids, and teachers. And so I think it's a wonderful sort of way to bring us all together and realize that we've all been on the same page. We've all been talking about similar things, and now we actually have a language to show that. In terms of how we work with teachers and so on, is that now, again, we can actually sort of specifically ask teachers, what are the things that you're most challenged with? How can we, during a field trip and with some pre and post activities, kind of help you address some of these things? But as you say, even among the children, learning how to ask the right questions and critique each other is an important part. So whether we're facilitating that discussion with the students themselves, and the students are seeing that, or the teachers seeing us facilitating that discussion, I think that everyone's looking for new ways of doing things, and that teachers have a lot of new ways, but because we're just starting out, the more different approaches to NGSS and eliciting the kind of feedback and work from your students, the more we'll all have a better way of sort of mapping out what works best. Just like every teacher is going to find their approach to curriculum and content, every teacher is going to find their own approach to addressing the practices. And it's similar here. I mean, we have our own approaches, but every educator is going to do it a little bit differently. So I feel really strongly right now that this is the time for educators of all kinds to kind of share works and what is very difficult about teaching to practice and process instead of content. But it's one that's a conversation that's worth having and that will probably continue for a couple years. But I really find that right now is this moment where, again, educators of all stripes, whether you're an after-school provider or a museum professional or a classroom teacher, let's get together and share what's been working about engaging kids, getting them to question, igniting passion, and addressing these kinds of practices. Nobody knows the answer. Nobody's cornered, the answer right now. So it's a great time to come together on equal footing and really share what our vision is for kids learning in the years to come.
I think that's a really important point, especially as you mentioned earlier. There's this it feels like this shift going on right now between what's a traditional model, if we want to call it that, of content sort of being out there and teachers having to be in that role of content expert, or sort of the sage on the stage whose job is to model facts and demonstrate phenomena and explain what all these ideas are, and then that traditional student role being to try and absorb as much as possible, remember it, and then recall or repeat, summarize what they've heard in order to demonstrate proficiency. And I think, again, I couldn't be in more agreement in support of the Next Generation Science Standards and also the National Research Council's work in helping give us a really clear definition of what effective science instruction, or we could call even STEM instruction, is. And I wanted to get your reflections on this, and just I'll read it real quick, but this is the actual definition from the National Research Council from 2011, that effective STEM instruction capitalizes on students' early interest and experiences, identifies and builds on what they know, and provides them with the experiences to engage them in the practices of science and sustain their interest, and those practices being the NGSS, these 8 high-level practices of questions, defining problems, developing and using models, and so on. And it seems like that's something that you all at the Creativity Museum, Children's Creativity Museum, have really mastered, and I think we're ahead of the curve because you predate the publishing of these practices for sure. What are your thoughts on that definition, and is that it from your science background? Does that resonate?
I mean, I think from my personal and scientific and now professional backgrounds, it really resonates. I mean, I feel like, as I mentioned, I thought I was going to be a journalist, but all along the way, I had effective science instruction that sustained me. It was my internal motivation and the fact that I really like science that got me to where I am today. And I didn't have pressure not to do science, but there was just nothing external that would have made me want to be a scientist. It was something inside that was sparked, that was nurtured, and that there was experiences doing and experiencing all along that kept me sustained. So I really believe in this idea about students' early interest. And again, it's not one thing that's going to spark them. It could be lots of different things. It could be multiple different kinds of science topics, or it could be dolphins at the aquarium, whatever it is. But I think this idea that really capitalizing on it. And the other thing I do want to emphasize as a scientist and an educator is that this in no way says that content is not important. Science is full of facts and figures. Math, there's things that you need to do. You need to be able to do some basic mathematical computational things. So I don't want folks to think that it's throwing away the value of knowledge or content, but the idea that content is embedded within activity and with applications and exploration and curiosity and on what kids are already interested in, to me that's sort of the key of sustaining that. If they're just interested in something, they find out that there's no substance to it, that's not going to keep kids interested either. I mean, kids do see through that. And so I think it's the pairing of real content, real substance, and challenges, things that are hard. Science isn't easy. It's not easy to invent new things, but it's all those things put together that I feel like this is what this definition is trying to say, is that it is about early interest, embedding it in content, but it's the practice of science that is the substance that they can go to when they're discouraged or they have lost interest in something. But it goes back to being curious and then having the tools and the practices of thinking logically, of answering questions, of iterating, all those kinds of things I think is what real science is about. And again, as we said, it's not just about science though, it's about your everyday life. It's about writing a novel, it's about producing a play or writing a screenplay. All those things are the same kind of exploration and dedication and passion and iteration and not resilience and not being discouraged and really realizing you have to rewrite your novel again, just like you have to rewrite your scientific experiment. So those are the kinds of things that I really love about this definition.
It's interesting because it seems similar to what we were discussing earlier when it came to the engineering design process and scientific methods. It's really, it seems like we're also at a point not only of kind of departing from a traditional model of science instruction, which is sort of an expert to a non-expert transfer of knowledge, which is quite linear, and also this idea that processes are entirely linear and non-creative, to something that's much more dynamic and something that's much more, so the idea that logic is still valid, the idea that content is still valid, but yet it's valid and nonlinear and in and of itself insufficient. You need more than just content, and you need more than just process. You need actually both and all of the above. And which kind of, I think, I don't know if that, would you agree with that? What are your thoughts
Yes.
on that, I guess?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I think it is also the inspiration. So I remember when I taught Geology 101, and someone would come back a little while later and say, I'm a business major, but you inspired me to look at the ocean in new ways, and I went on vacation. All I did was tell my girlfriend all these things about the ocean, and she got really bored. And I remember there's this moment where it's about the content, it's about looking at the world in new ways. He's driven along that ocean for so many times, but he never had the questions until he learned some content. And then being so inspired by it that he had to share it with somebody. So I do think that it is this moment where, the content alone, process alone, and inspiration alone doesn't work. But you put those things together in the right place, and someone can be sparked to think in new ways, ask new questions, and to change their life, So maybe lose a girlfriend in the process. But I think that you're right, that it's this kind of these intangibles as well as content and practice that makes a difference in someone's life.
Do you feel like and this is a little off topic here, but do you feel as your background has sort of evolved from scientist to scientist, educator to scientist educator, museum director, that sort of core scientific or engineering spirit, the STEM spirit you have, has sort of shaped perhaps labs that you've chosen to put into the museum, or programs that you've chosen, perhaps over other labs or other programs that you could have put in for some of those reasons you just mentioned?
I think it is about the approach to the topic that might be different. That there could be topics that we've all agreed to do, but coming from a scientific and science educator perspective, I know that some things are more effective. I definitely don't want to teach misconceptions of science, and I think it's so easy to fall into that. So I'm very careful in really monitoring that kind of thing in any of the museums I've worked with. The other thing that I think where the science education comes in, the science and the education come together, is trying to understand the child development studies and the learning studies. There's so many things that are being published these days, and I think as educators and parents we're a little overwhelmed. And I think sometimes my scientific background is in, I don't know about that result. Let me look at the data and see if it really says that. I think that's something I also bring to my current job, is sort of a belief in data.
Sure.
And I think that as a parent, I think it's also really good. There's so much information on what you should and shouldn't do with your kids or feed them. And sometimes I find that it's better to kind of rely on my scientific skepticism to really analyze the data before I jump to conclusions.
It's interesting. I mean, it's another version of what we're looking at here. It's that idea that it's not deferring to somebody who you mimic, but in fact engaging in the process yourself and appealing to the data and really kind of almost prosecuting the data. And it's quite interesting. One of the things that also really impressed me at the museum was that there were a lot of synergies that overlap not only with the STEM sort of side of KnowAtom world, but these practices, these processes, and really a model that's a next generation model of instruction that is the departure from the traditional model where content's flowing through an expert and students are absorbing it, but to something that's really students developing skills or honing skills even. and those being science and engineering practice skills, higher order thinking skills, and all the parts we sort of talked about here, but that student being really in direct contact with the content, with the cross-cutting concepts, or the sort of systems thinking, or the system behavior of the content. So watching the museum staff interacting with the students, and I'm sure that parents and so on, as you're coaching them, really playing the role of a guide and really helping to provide supports and helping students engage appropriately, and like you were saying earlier, questioning the students and sort of not getting between the student and the content, but helping to actually strengthen that relationship. And then in our case, when we think about K-12 education in the classroom, we're always looking, of course, as a way to assess all, how do we assess all of this? So on the assessment side, we would look at that and say, hey, can students actually demonstrate their knowledge? Can they develop and use the content? Are they using the STEM skills to solve problems, and so on? Was that, again, sort of an intentional piece, or was that something that kind of evolved, or where did it evolve from? Since, again, the museum kind of, I guess, predates a lot of this thinking, but somehow got there first.
Right. Well, I think in some ways, it may have been nobody really comes to museums and pays to think that they're going to be talking to a teacher. And so I think that in some ways it's a disadvantage, because we're seen as more of an entertainment on the weekends. And so I think that we had to approach it as in, we are going to be the guide on the side, as they say. And in most museums, we call our educators facilitators, because we're about facilitating learning. And it's almost like museums in general have always had to do sort of stealth education, right? You go to a zoo because you think you're going to see animals and have fun. But you know what? Seeing animals and having fun and learning are not mutually incompatible. And we'd hope that when you're going there, you're also learning and changing your attitudes, which is what learning is, right? Changing your belief system, as well as content acquisition. So I think the funny thing is that, it's been that way because of the visitor expectations, and they coming to a museum wanting to do a social activity with their family. And so again, we've been kind of being stealthy educators, and so our role has been to sort of facilitate learning and to ensure that there's interactions that are opportunities for learning and for family engagement. And that's why we love Next Generation Science Standards, and now it kind of gives us a structure and a way to talk to educators and some value to what we do. But again, we can't compare to a classroom teacher where there's all those hours that you spend with them, and that there's content you need to teach them. It's okay if we don't teach them certain things, because it will happen in the classroom. And so it's really a true partnership between the in-school and out-of-school, I think. And when we look at NGSS as a way to bring us together and look at an ecosystem of learning, and how all of us need to reinforce each other, and that there's some things they can learn at a zoo they can't learn in the classroom, but we really depend on the classroom to deliver so much content, and yet we're now expecting them to do all these other inspiring and facilitating and so on. It's a tough job for sure. I mean, I couldn't survive a month in a classroom, but I love being in a museum, and so it's different, but at the same time, we need to go on the strengths that we have. Teachers get to have kids for a whole year and spend so many hours with them. That's such a luxury that we don't have, and we envy at museums. We would love to be able to spend more time with your kids. But what we do have is we have the luxury of having people come in wanting to have fun and being open-minded and wanting to be engaged. They came in here being engaged already. And so we have that as our advantage, and then we just have to squeeze so much in a 2-hour visit. And so we just each have to be good at our context and what the other does.
Sure, and I really like that visual too of almost learning by accident. You think you're going to go to the zoo, you think you're going to go to the museum and see some cool animals that don't live on your street, but at the same time, you're going to learn something because the people at the museum have been so thoughtful about the way they've constructed this experience. And I wanted to ask you about that because I think the Children's Creativity Museum has a really distinct advantage, especially over a zoo where you go to the zoo, you see the animal, and then you have to sort of deconstruct and understand all about that animal. The Children's Creativity Museum is I would view that as a constructive experience where perhaps there's a problem or a question that students or children have to come and creatively construct meaning from, or sort of, you know, if the challenge was to navigate a maze or so on, the student has to figure out how to do that with the tools available, the robot, the tablet, the programming language. Do you see a difference in that approach? Because oftentimes in K-12 education we see a default, perhaps under a traditional model, where things are almost by default deconstructed versus constructed.
Right. Well, I think that by starting from like a blank slate instead of deconstructing an existing product, I think you open it more, it's more open-ended, and you can come up with some very surprising end results. So if our challenge is, to build a shelter, and you start from the form of a house, you can be creative within that context, but there's sort of a limit to it. Whereas if you give the challenge as in, if you go to Mars, how would you build a shelter? And it's not starting from what you think is going to be the result, but it could be, you dig a hole underground. It could be that, you're building a house. It could be all these other ways of sort of approaching the same challenge. I think that it's more, you're more able to really have divergent thinking. And there's a place and time for convergent and for limitations, and there's also a time for this really open-ended, big, audacious, crazy ideas. And so I think that, both can be valuable, but I think when we sort of, we have to be intentional about doing that if we want there to be really open-ended discovery and kids being able to come up with something completely new and completely on their own and feeling real ownership of something. Then I think the first way of being constructive is a more effective way to do that. Because it really allows you to value what a kid brings, their imagination, their experience, some crazy idea that they've seen, or some, some metaphor, or something, that they have in their mind's eye. And I think by not restricting it early on, you're allowing them to do that, valuing that, appreciating their contributions, and then maybe then go to more convergent thinking, like, would you think that would work? What are the tools you would need to make that happen? What are the challenges of making that design? And then they come up with the idea saying, yeah, you're right, this could be modified in this way. You're right, if I think about it this way, what if I did this? What if I tried this material? So I think starting from a really wide open and then allowing them to challenge their own thinking, their own design, I think gives them more empowerment, and then they feel more confident in what they produce. So I think that process, if you have the time to do it, I think it really creates a real learning environment where you're applying lots of different practices and that kids can bring their best to meet that challenge.
I really like that picture of empowerment, and not only empowerment of the students, but also the teachers. And in wrapping up, I know that the museum regularly offers events, workshops, and across all these different stakeholder groups that we've talked about, parents, students, and teachers. And I wanted to ask you that, given all of the people that will be hearing this across the U.S. and even internationally, many of them are likely to cross through San Francisco, downtown San Francisco. What opportunities are there for folks who say, yeah, I've been stuck in a traditional model, trying to get to effective STEM instruction, trying to get to a next generation model. I know I need to learn more about how to question students appropriately, engage their higher order thinking. How can they engage with the museum to meet some of those needs?
Yes, well, the teachers in the Bay Area, we have thousands of school children who come here on field trips. But if you're not from this area, you come by and see what we're doing with the kids and talk to our educators. You can make an appointment, but also just talk to the many facilitators who are on the floor. All of them also work on field trips, and have a conversation and engage us and ask us questions and what the challenges are. And I would also say that it's not just our museum, but there's many museums that are doing this kind of great work. And the Association of Children's Museums, the Association of Science Technology Centers, and the American Association of Museums are just 3 resources you could go to and find out who's in your neighborhood, who's doing interesting work. There is also the Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education, CAISE, and they have a great resource of publications and assessments that have been used in informal science education. And again, many of us in museums have been doing things sort of without knowing that they're aligned to next generation science standards. And so I think hopefully those will be some good resources. One other place that I would just point you to is howtosmile.org, howtosmile.org, and it's a website of museum activities, hands-on activities that have worked in many different museums, and you might be able to use those in your own classroom, and they're aligned to science standards as well.
That's great. I appreciate your sharing those resources and really appreciate your time and really helping us understand really not only the Children's Creativity Museum, but where museums are headed in the 21st century and what we can hope to expect from field trips and professional development experiences that we can take back to our class, and also I think as parents as well, being able to not only go and enjoy a great vista, but to be able to engage in creating and participating in that moment and creating the museum. So thank you, Carol. I appreciate your time, and I hope that everybody who's joined us will visit Carol and our friends at the Children's Creativity Museum in person in their San Francisco location in the Yerba Buena Gardens in downtown San Francisco, and visit them online. They have a fantastic website at creativity.org, which is one of my favorite URLs. Thank you very much, Carol, for your time.
Thank you so much.